apologise. I don't actually have an informed and florid presentation. It's just me sitting and talking, so I hope you can cope with that. I'm going to try to do something different here. It's not it's more of a kind of philosophical piece, and so it's kind of throwing ideas out as well. So I hope that's okay with everybody. So the title of the paper is Augustinian Patriarchs and Palegianist Praxis, Redefining the Possibility of Agency Within Educational Study. So the Journal of Philosophy of the Royal Institute of Philosophy was founded in 1925 by the then Home Secretary Lord Balfour. A publication born in a propitious age of English positivism and its aesthetes, it remains an important volume with a modus operandi which seemingly wishes to philosophically antagonize intellectual normalcy. In this light, a recent offering from 2010 saw Dr. Rupert Read from the University of East Anglia publish a paper entitled On Philosophy's Lack of Progress, from Plato to Wittgenstein and Rawls, in which he argued that though philosophy has in fact gained age and vintage by its diverse and varied pursuits, there's yet to be a demonstrable extenuation in its wisdom. Read goes on to argue this by arguing that the political philosopher John Rawls' treatment of the notion of justification, which he says is lacking and even inferior to Euthyphro's, the 3rd century Greek. We know that history more broadly presents us with moral contradictions, such as those presented by Dr. Read. It was Karl Marx who said that history repeats itself, first as tragedy and then second as farce. Could the same be said of intellectual history, I wonder? It is my primary contention in this presentation that the debate over agency and structure ought not only be viewed from the lens of intellectual history, but can also be extenuated by it. By this I refer to the similarities of the agency and structure debate which are found across intellectual traditions, prototypically where the individual begins to comport himself to the demands of a perceived ulteriority or structure. Thinking thus, one may begin to see discussions of agency and structure traced to ideas of theodicy, divine grace, Promethean man, or human will. Though these are distant relatives, they remain important family resemblances to contemporary debates on agency and structure. In this light, I wish to conduct an intellectual experiment using the 5th century theological discussion between St. Augustine of Hippo and the English heterodox theologian Pelagius, which I believe can inform 21st century debates on the nature of social structure and a gentle will. How I propose to do this is by reconsidering the normative stance of the debate, i.e., rather than starting with sociological consideration about the individual, or rather what the individual may know about the educational system in her place or her place in society, I propose a discussion of the ontological presumption on what the defining features of an individual is in relation to freedom. In a word, it is an attempt to turn the table of academic debate towards that which may spur new ideas on how we may approach the problem of agency and structure in educational study. It is also important to state a disclaimer here that I'm not proposing a solution to the problem, rather only offering an avenue of thought to see the problem in lieu of an intellectual architecture which may support and buttress these new intellectual avenues. So the importance of this debate under review, namely that of man's relative autonomy from the divine, cannot be underestimated for church history or even within Islam for that matter, as the first 3 church councils all take positions on what they call the analogia entis, or the metaphysical link between God and man, and it is Augustine's position which helps to form early consensus on this matter. It is therefore necessary to briefly describe this logical discussion for those, including myself, who are very familiar with it. Augustine affirms that freedom exists for the human being rather, i.e. that man is not impressed upon by necessity to act. However, human free will is weakened by the original sin of Adam, and restoring our free will requires divine grace. Therefore, perfect freedom lies in the moment of perfect submission for Augustine. Christ is the historical figure whose wounds, says the book of Isaiah, maintains we are whose wounds we are healed, i.e. through divine pardon. To illustrate this, he uses the analogy of 2 pan scales, with one weighed down by sin, thus driving the individual towards evil. Augustine further claims in his De Natura de Gratia on nature and grace that, quote, the weakness which darkens and disables man's good natural quality as a result of his nature needs enlightenment and healing. through divine grace, and did not come rather from the blameless maker, but from the original sin, which was committed by free will. In the Latin is librium artibrium. For this reason, our guilty nature is liable to a just penalty. End quote. This would imply that we are the reason of the original sin, that unguided free will is the making of our celestial undoing. One can conclude that salvation for Augustine is the free and unmerited gift of God, whereas for Pelagius, as we shall see, salvation occurs principally through reliance on one's innate propensity to imitate the example of Christ. Now, Pelagius, a contemporary of Augustine, gives favour to the idea of absolute human freedom. We are born free, he maintains, and have responsibility for our sins. To state, as Augustine did, imperfections in our nature reflects negatively on the goodness of God, which would be wrong. As such, we are not affected by an original sin. Pelagius concludes that God knows what we are capable of doing and doesn't burden us more than what we are capable. He says, quote, since perfection is possible for humanity, it is an obligation, end quote, and so renders the human being to a stoic life of moral uprightness. Considered a suspicious theological treatise primarily for questioning the sovereignty of God, Pelagius subsequently lost goodwill with the church and was condemned a heretic under the councils of Carthage in 481. Having said this, you may wonder, how does this relate to the agency and structure debate of today's social sciences? It's a good question. In the Augustine-Pelagius debate, we are left with key propositions, I believe, that find home in contemporary debates on agency and structure, i.e. man's nature in relation to that of God, or what is the agent's position vis-a-vis social structure. Importantly, there are issues pertaining to grace, or structural limits upon social actors, and free will, or the common nomenclature being praxis. Taken together, it is my contention that many attempts to resolve contemporary agency structure debates often approach an Augustinian impasse by virtue of relying on matters of association, which are tantamount to Augustine's notion of grace. By this I mean agency is conceptualized as an ulteriority or other, and not seen as sui generis, i.e. a unique category or feature of the agent himself. Agency therefore becomes contingent, whereas Pelagianism stresses freedom as prima facie categories. Considering the agent structured literature within educational studies, one can illustrate approaches which bear this Augustinian impasse. Here I shall briefly discuss some of these under the headings cognitive functions, linguistic positioning, and cultural awareness. So firstly, in terms of cognitive functions, let us consider critical realism, which, as Potter and Lopez correctly affirm, is a very broad church. However, a consistent feature remains that the unknowability of truth does not preclude relativism. Here, agency becomes a reflexive program, as in Margaret Archer's recent work on the internal conversation. Though ontologically realist, there is little means by which outside the realms of the social, elements of agency can be known. It is then not unfamiliar to Bourdieu with field analysis, which is often criticized on account of erecting positions which are juxtaposed to relative nodes in iterative analysis. Therefore, though it speaks of will, critical realism shackles agencies to the realms of socially constructed freedom rather than pairing above it. Secondly, linguistic positioning refers to the focus of language in determining agents of efficacy within education. Most notably here, the work of Basil Bernstein stands out through his deconstruction of linguistic codes, representing a vigorous class struggle exercised in pedagogic encounters. Primarily a discursive practice, domination is exercised in a manner by which certain classes are limited by this process to the vernacular of power structures. Bernstein himself argues, quote, the ambiguity which lies at the heart of the social is realized in the concept of code, which at the same time as it relies upon ordering principles and their related practices necessarily opens a space for the potential of their change. The pedagogic device, he claims, creates an arena of conflict over its ownership and monopoly. Bernstein argues that social change is intrinsic to the actor, yet the context required for pedagogic discourse tends to dissolve the importance of human agency in Schelling's analysis of Bernstein. This is also substantiated in the fieldwork of sociologists such as Kirk and Collenbrock, who, drawing on Bernstein's frameworks, failed to restore semblance of agency in the determinacy of social discourses of power, specifically in schooling. Finally, cultural analysis or awareness. This is related to social literacies that create cleavages for agency. For example, Hammersley's famous work on differentiation and polarization, and to a lesser extent the work of Paulo Freire, attempts to mediate the roles of systemic power and agency in the classroom. However, this is based on the ascertaining of empirical regularities on which to build theoretical analysis. The problem here is, as Giddens rightly identifies, that presuming ostensible regularities delimits the nature of praxis before the occasion of structure is confronted. Giddens himself, within his structuration theory, presents a cultural hue to the agency and structure debate, drawing upon the idea of capability as intrinsic to human beings. Even in oppressed situations, he presumes a knowability of agents in that they will have a great knowledge of the societies in which they live. In this guise, structurationist theories present an individualized, rational, third-way market consumer whose discursive consciousness voices opinions on social contexts. However, problems for Giddens' theory remain as to the way in which the vicissitudes of change in society may actually occur, pointed out, for example, in the famous critique by Margaret Archer, as well as the problem of merging agency with consciousness, so making it an abstracted and disembodied act. As Furlong maintains, quote, people do not reject abstract social structures, they reject real teachers going about the day-to-day business of schooling, end quote. So returning to Pelagius' heterodox position on human agency, we find that by placing the argument on its head, by starting with ontology, we are defining what the individual is capable of, though not in Giddens' sense. Our position may be seen as not unsimilar to Kantian categories of intellection. However, contrasting with Kant, the idea of freedom is not a cognitive structure, but rather a sui generis disposition to the human being. Thus, when we commonly consider ideas of freedom and capacity for praxis in education literature, they bear, as mentioned, an Augustinian hue, by which I mean person X can do X by virtue of A and B, whereby an ulteriority is struck. This is what I refer to as tantamount to Augustine's notion of grace, creating distance between the individual and the social occasion of agency. Alternatively, the Pelagian heterodoxy, which we may call educated praxis, begins from ontology, not sociology. Educated praxis subsequently emphasizes a way of directing the importance of the individual's capability by placing her a priori distinctiveness, so that person X can do X by virtue of being an instantiated being. Having said this, questions necessarily strike up with my thesis. Three principal objections include, and I'm sure you guys have many others. Firstly, if we are endowed with this agency claimed by educated praxis, you must realize that it can't be exercised in all situations. True. A prisoner, for example, can't exercise his agency, but it does not mean that he has none. My concern here is to consider the ways intellectual formulations of such ideas are redolent with a presupposition of structure, i.e. the Augustinian impasse. Secondly, thinking that people have such freedom claimed by educated praxis is not apodictic or provable. True, understandably so, as otherwise it would create a liquid form of solipsism, that thinking thus creates thus. But this is a double-edged sword without a handle, as thinking is the first means to reconsidering the problem, but not its end. It is, so for example, Karl Marx's understanding of man as rationalizing animal changes the nature of society, inasmuch Democritus' proposition that man is made of pure matter does. This paper is then nothing more than the probing of the recess of the academic imagination through thinking anew. This is why I've chosen ontology for the basis of the framework in ontology, epistemology, or even etiology, which is the study of causes. Thirdly, the third criticism of my own paper is that does not, by making educated praxis thought-dependent, remove the potential for an embodied and lived agential experience, something I have accused Giddens of. In responding to this criticism, I wish to take cue from Macbeth, who, in dialoguing with Rosencrantz, says, "For there is nothing either good or bad, except thinking makes it so." I believe this phrase grasps the point well, particularly that thinking does not make an idea necessarily more efficacious. However, I would have to take objection with the bard here. Firstly, that thought is the means to declaring a relation to real circumstances, and secondly, educative praxis as an embodied form of agency, primarily as it relates to a person, what a person is, irrespective of what they know. The presentation has offered the need for ontology or arguments centered on being rather than knowing, which creates a different lens to see the pedagogic process as well as the individual's place in society. So in concluding, I've attempted to place the perennial agency structure argument on its head by articulating notions of the self that may lead through what I've identified as the Augustinian empaths. This I attempted by taking on Palegian's proposition of freedom too, presenting a natural and embodied notion of agency for the occasion of interacting in society. This is what I've called educative praxis. Importantly, how one is stopped from turning this theory into a form of solipsism, i.e. assuming it to be real by thinking it so, is the positive assumption that not only is the individual endowed with certain capabilities, yet those capabilities are not consciously limited to the performance of the individual in a specific social milieu, but are non-contingent, whereas Augustinian emphasis is a contingent form of social agency. In this manner, the theory presented here is a necessary form of agency and not a sufficient one. By this I mean that the ontological distinctiveness of the individual actor presents a first-order discussion on the nature of actors, giving alacrity to the ways in which we may begin to see educative practice developed in learning institutions. This is something that may give us better understanding of the trivium of problems related to agency structure, namely student enfranchisement, inequality, and alienation. So furthermore, what I've attempted to do in this very short presentation is to show via the analogy with a theological discussion is how the perennial concerns of agency and structure can be viewed in terms that are once familiar and mercurial, in order to show firstly it is a human problem enunciated through intellectual history, so that such a debate can be framed by using a 5th century religious discussion does not, I believe, delimit its rigor, but rather show how it can be understood in a variety of ways, and potentially to see ideas of structure as not subsisting in one idea of agency, or as agency as not being one specific thing. Could we then not have a discussion of the varying kinds of agency that one can be exposed to, or structures that impede or free actors? These are questions for further deliberations, though at this juncture it is enough to conclude that knowing Pelagius spent much of his life on the peripheries of a Christian thought, attempted to gain favour with the church after having locked horns with Augustine. However, though a peripheral 5th century intellectual figure, I believe his ideas on innate human free will may surprisingly fare better in the 21st century. Thank you.